Welcome and thank you for joining us. It is December 17th and we are having a goat and sheep webinar tonight with a producer spotlight, excuse me, Jed Fiskness from Fiskness Family Farms here near Osakness, Minnesota and West Central Minnesota. He is going to join us and give us a little bit of overview on his farm, some things that they have going on there. They've had all sorts of livestock, sheep and goats, poultry, beef. And he's going to give us just some oversight on some farm history, what they're doing now, some lessons learned along the way. He's done a lot of different experimenting in different areas of management there on his farm. And then they also do marketing with their farm products. So I think they have some really fun and interesting strategies. And we are going to let Jed take that away, and I'll let him explain about his farm and introduce himself a little bit more. And then this is just going to be kind of a discussion. So if you have questions at any time, please drop them in the chat box and Travis will pick them up and we will get those all answered. So don't be afraid to ask any questions. And like I said, this is a discussion and it's going to be what you guys make of it. So like I said, Jed has a lot of really fun things that he's tried over the years, and I will leave it at that. And Jed, go ahead and we're excited to hear your story.
Well, sounds good. Well, like Brenda said, my name is Jed Fiskness. I've lived my entire life in central Minnesota, pretty much all around the Osakis area, and grew up on a dairy farm and crop farm that had problems in the 80s. And actually, my dad went to work in town and still farmed part-time. I worked in a sporting goods industry for 18 years, kind of farming along the side. Almost 17 years ago, my wife and I and our two young children at the time moved out to the farm we're on now, and our farm started with 6 chickens. Um, wasn't too long after the chickens showed up, we got involved in 4-H, which meant rabbits right away, and then the kids got interested in dairy goats. And our first goats we had on the farm were dairy goats. From there, we branched off into beef cattle, hogs, turkeys, guinea hens, all kinds of different other animals, and we had Katahdin hair sheep for quite a while. And then we really started getting into the meat goat side of things and kept adding more and more options when it came to the boar goats, particularly. We've also had Kikos, Savannahs, and a lot of different crosses. Um, Currently on the farm, almost 3 years ago now, we got hit by a tornado that came through the area and wiped out just about all of our infrastructure. So we ended up having to start over, basically from square one with a lot of things rebuilding, and it changed the structure of our farm drastically by necessity. Right now, currently, we're running a fairly large meat goat herd with a lot of crosses and some dairy goats mixed into it. And we have a fairly large poultry group we're running also for laying hens, and then started laying hens. And then we, in the summer, raise and process a large number of poultry. And that really kind of um, works along with our entire strategy with the farm for raising the animals. We've gotten more and more into the rotational grazing side of things. So up until this year, we've been running goats through first, followed by a grazing component, which was beef cows and young stock, and then the chickens would come up behind that. New coming up this year, we're actually going to probably be replacing the cattle portion back in with hair sheep again, just as a kind of a change of pace. And the way our structure and infrastructure is now set up, after as we've been rebuilding, the smaller animals will work into that structure a little bit better. I really enjoy working with the goats. They're probably my favorite animal that we have on the farm, but I do enjoy the sheep and the poultry also. Um, our farm is very, very diverse. We don't run a lot of acres. We do some crop farming. We raise our own hay. We also do some market garden component to it because we market at farmers markets. We do a fairly large operation also along with that of direct marketing, particularly on the chicken side, the egg side, laying hen side, baby chicks, all that kind of stuff. We've tried a lot of different marketing. We've done and still do a lot of our goats and the beef cattle go to different private buyers. We sell a lot of the goats to private buyers that come to the farm to buy larger groups. We don't do small sales usually off the farm, but come in and buy larger groups. We have 3 or 4 different guys that come in and buy larger groups of animals. We use different auction sources. We've done really well, particularly raising replacement breeding bucks. We have a pretty nice line of pulled breeding bucks, along with some dapples, and then some pretty nice black cape animals that have done very well for us. I like to adapt. I do a lot of different things. We also run a feed business off the farm. We work as a seed rep. I sell goat and sheep equipment. Um, I could just kind of keep going on and on about the different stuff we do on the farm. I really believe diversity is a way to make a farm successful anymore. It's hard to be just into one thing and consistently be profitable in it. But by having lots of different options and streams of revenue, really seems to help keep our farm running better. We've been consistently trying and changing out fencing on our farm. Currently, we're right in the process of switching most of our main exterior fencing over to cattle panels or multi-purpose heavy panels, just to make sure we don't have deer issues with them tearing the fence down. Interior fencing for the rotational grazing. We've been mostly using like Premier One style electronet fencing. That works really well as long as the goats don't get too smart and figure out how to get through it and get underneath it. But that's a kind of a constant experiment. We've been changing our paddock sizes a lot. We originally started out with 2-acre paddocks, which worked well for the cattle. Goats and the chickens, they were too big to be managed. So we're actually been slowly cutting them down and finally settled on half acre rotation for the rotational grazing with the animals. And it means you got to move them a little more often with the cattle, which is one reason why we're looking at maybe switching over to the sheep so that the rotational pattern can follow more closely to what we were doing with the goats. Marketing can be very challenging and changes on a constant basis. If we're talking on the goat and going forward on the sheep side, my plan with that is to continue selling most of them not directly to consumers, but to go through a middleman broker. Whereas the beef we had and then the chicken and the eggs, those are all direct to consumer sales. We're going to continue to grow probably all facets of our business, but one thing that we really want to get started again this year that we haven't had for quite a while is a on the farm stand that'll be open a couple of days a week for people to swing in and pick up stuff from our produce, from our chickens, stuff that my daughters both run cottage food in businesses, so they do a lot of baking and everything else. So there's just a lot of things we got going on.
Thanks, Jed. I know you said one time, actually, you've told me this multiple times, that you've tried all of these different animals and all these different things, and you always come back that goats are your most profitable species or area. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, I sure can. So I keep pretty close track of all the different facets of our business. And consistently, I'm not going to say every single year, but most consistently, goats are always the highest profitability for the least input and the least amount of work. We've done chickens are probably the number 2, but there's a lot more labor that's involved with the raising of the chickens, the handling of the chickens, and the fact that we're dealing with a lot more, animal count. And I've always enjoyed working with the cattle, and they've consistently, up until about the last 2 years, have actually been my least profitable part of the farm equation. Um, the goats, I like them just because one, you can get a pretty quick turnaround. They're not on the farm as long. I do run a pretty aggressive feeding strategy, pushing protein and high energy feeds to try to get the animals to market weight as fast as possible. My goal is to have particularly the wither type boars off the farm by the time they're 4.5 months old, and maybe at a maximum 5 months. And I'm shooting for a 60 to 70 pound weight at those ages. And with the genetics that I have and my feeding program that I utilize, I pretty consistently hit those marks.
Hi, Jed. Travis Hoffman here, our NDSU and University of Minnesota Extension sheep specialist. And so you touched on with your nutrition program and with the genetics that you have, we can reach those goals. Can you expound on that just a little bit, how we're going to get them to that 60, 70 pounds and what your story is to make it happen?
Yeah, certainly. So I've worked quite a bit with trying to get a good size birth weight. I don't want them too big, but I like to see a lot of times on twins, 9 to 11 pound um, kids, particularly on the bucks. And we leave them on. We do a late weaning. We feed all the way up to 12 weeks. We leave them on the parents or on the mother, and we actually consistently feed the does a 16%. Actually, it's a lactating goat ration to allow them to produce more milk. And actually, I have one of my lines of goats have actually, most of them are anywhere from a quarter to an eighth dairy, particularly Alpine in their ancestry. And those goats produce a lot more milk. And I have consistently an extra 5, maybe even 10 pounds of weaning weight on the babies that come off of those goats. I don't have a high end show herd by any means. My goats are commercial, they're production animals. I want them to be healthy, happy, but grow quickly. And when it comes to feed, I am a feed salesman. I work for Big Gain out of Mankato, Minnesota, and I do use their feeding program. I've tweaked it quite extensively, but I run a high protein ration. I start them on a high protein creep feed all the way up until at least 2 to 3 weeks post weaning, and I run them on a high protein feed actually all the way up until market. Then I have the lowest feed that my standard boar goats get is an 18% ration along with a good quality hay. So I do push it. It is a little more expensive than some of the more traditional ways of feeding, but I get them off the farm quicker and at a higher weight, which on the bottom end makes my bottom line better.
So just a quick clarification. An access to feeds for the young kids, when are those beginning to get supplemented that's different or augmented from just the milk from mom?
I want them to be in the creep feeders, starting to look and nose around at the creep feed at about 10 days old.
Okay, rock
I,
and
I have
rolling.
I have a high protein feed. We actually train them to go into there. In our barn system, a lot of times our creep feeder is where we have some auxiliary heat, either heat lamps or a heat mat. So it gets them to start coming into those areas. In the real cold weather, we use chemical totes cut in half with a heat lamp on the top of them to make a little warming hut for them. And we put the feed in there. That way they know to look for the feed. They're actively looking for it. And once they start eating it, they generally really start their intake on it somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks of age. And that really moves them forward, gives them the extra protein, and it really gets that rumen development going. If you can get a rumen development started and going at a younger age, and that takes feed intake, whether it's feed or hay or even bedding, something in there to get the rumen up and running, really makes a big difference as those goats start to get a little bit bigger. And as they start, a lot of times we don't even have to wean the babies. By the time 12 weeks rolls around, 11 to 12 weeks, the mothers are starting to self wean, and they've really pushed them off into the feed. And we choose to not switch the feed types until at least 2 weeks after complete weaning. That way they don't have a shock of being weaned and having to switch feed types at the same time. We've used to switch to an 18% ration right at weaning, and it just seemed to slow their rate of gain down far enough that it seemed to cause enough issues that we went to the little bit different strategy. Another thing that I've been monkeying with in one of my boar goat lines is we have a pulled component to it now, and we're not having to dehorn. And we were running into, particularly on some of the show animals, my kids show for 4-H, and in order to just show, you have to dehorn. And we were seeing pretty substantial rate of growth slowing when we dehorned, even at a young age. And by not having to do that, the pulled line has allowed us to actually even get a faster rate of gain without having to worry about that extra stressor.
Okay, super. I'm going to go backwards a little bit there, but we'll go backwards to go forward, Jed. All right.
Okay.
You gave plenty of quick descriptions about your animals, but what I found fun there, as you brought it up, is just a little bit analogous to my grandfather, and my family had primarily sheep and cattle. okay, in comparison to the goats. But from a cattle standpoint, is that his ideal cow had a quarter to an eighth brown Swiss genetics. And that's pretty darn analogous to kind of what you were thinking of, just adding that extra amount of Alpine. And so when I was a youngster or a teenager, I'm like, I don't even know if you know what you're doing, right? And then the older you get, the smarter you realize that Grandpa probably had a pretty good idea, right? And so
Yep.
you get the chance to learn, like, whoa, there's some advantages in terms of milk production, right? As we think about it again, bringing it back to our goats of the Alpines, and I suppose you could probably use even like Saanens or Nubians maybe would be still an option. I guess my thought process from a genetics standpoint there is, Jed, is that even if people have Spanish or more commercial goats, and dependent of whether those are even boars as well, is that how would we incorporate that? I mean, you just said that it was a quarter to an eighth is good. Well, good news. But it's tough to find one, or to purchase maybe even a billy or a buck that's a half blood genetics. So how would we get there? I mean, or how did you make that process and said, okay, the quarter blood is where I want to be? Sorry for the tricky question, but you started with the tricky answer, and now I just got to get there.
So it's the problem, like you mentioned, is you can't get that consistently. So we of course started when we were growing our herd. We couldn't find affordable full blood boar or meat type animals. They were just too expensive. So I work with a lot of Amish, and I had the opportunity to be able to buy some Dolings that were crossbreds. They were half boar, half Alpine, and that's how we got started with it. We bought them just because we wanted to add numbers to our herd. Well, all of a sudden we saw these massive weaning weights. The problem is that even taking that half and half and then getting to a quarter, you had to get to that point before you would get them to not look dairy type and get discounted at the market. A lot of times, by the time you get to that quarter, then they're going to look boar or enough boar like that you don't get discounted. And even at an eighth, definitely they no longer carry that a lot of the dairy characteristics in their looks. The boar seems to be a stronger thing, other than I do have some really long-legged boars because of the dairy influence. They seem to carry that long-legged trait longer than they do any other trait. But we're constantly breeding back and forth. We keep 2 Alpine bucks on hand, and we'll actually breed back into the does sometimes to bring, like the Dolings, to bring in more of the dairy genetics as we get down under an eighth or something like that. And then occasionally we'll get them that they look boar and they throw dairy kids. So there are some disadvantages to two, but for the most part we see a positive rate of gain.
Absolutely. Thank you for that discussion. And yeah, I mean, when you think about it from a genetic program, anytime that you have crossbreeding of animals that are quite diverse in terms of their talents and traits, then the progeny and offspring can be anything along that range, right? And so, like you said, they can be even primarily boar and come out visually looking different, or even the opposite, and maybe have that extra special kind of maternal traits as well. So I have a question from our chat box, and I'd appreciate and encourage everybody that we have to ask some of those questions. But I want to dig into the dehorning as it was put in there on just some information before we get too far in our discussion. And so the question is, if you saw that, is what age was the dehorning when you saw a negative impact on growth? And then again, a clarification, was this disbudding or was it dehorning?
Okay, so we've done it both routes. So we've also over the past have raised large quantities of Alpine and Saanen type bucklings and the dairy types. And so we got them at anywhere from 1 to 3 days of age, and we were dehorning them for the market we were selling to up in Moorhead at about 6 to 7 days of age. So we were disbudding them, and they always set them way back. So we actually went to doing some banding. So it was more of a dehorning situation at a later age, actually about the time we were castrating at about 10 weeks. And we saw less setback there than we did when they were little and we were doing the disbudding. But we still saw enough setback in the stress from the banding that we went to the polled line. And I guess it's maybe just a personal thing, but I see that they just don't hit that plateau like they do when it seemed like when I was banding the horns at a heavier weight.
Okay, thank you. I think from a young goat management class, if that's the case, all right, is that I would be somewhat interested in learning your animal health approach. Okay, and so again, we're going down a lot of different paths, but
Yep.
those goats that we have, you said that we're going to work on the horns there at about 7 days. Is that when you're working them? Are you keeping males again intact? What vaccination protocol do you work with, and then your thoughts?
Yep. So vaccination protocol is pretty easy. We run a standard CD and T vaccine program. We give the does 30 to 45 days before kidding. We vaccinate the entire doe groups before kidding, and then when we're banding or castrating or dehorning, then we give a booster of the CD and T to the babies, and then follow that up at 30 days again. So we don't castrate until a later age for multiple reasons. One, just to prevent urinary calculi, allow larger development of the urinary tract system. And I want the testosterone in there for a while. It actually works as a natural growth aid, and you see a quicker rate of gain if you don't castrate them at a young age. It does set them back a day or two, banding them at an older age, but I've seen way more advantages waiting and doing it at an older age to disadvantage. When I first started, the guy I was working with gave me advice, and he castrated and banded under a week old. He dishorn, band, do everything at once, and he couldn't figure out why he had so much trouble with urinary calculi. He was losing a fair number of goats to urinary tract problems, and by going to a little bit of a later age for castration, allow urinary tract to develop a lot more completely, seems to eliminate that, even on a market animal that isn't going to be around a long time.
Wise beyond your years, Jed. Wise beyond your years. All right. So for a quick clarification, as he said, from a vaccination of C, D, and T, that is our Clostridium perfringens CD, and the T is tetanus. Okay, and so you can get C and D, or you can get C, D, and T. I kind of like to think that there's value to having the tetanus in it as well as you do. Also, yep. Your point is valid in urinary calculi, and so urinary calculi is an increase primarily based on calcium accumulations in the urethra, or along the gastrointestinal tract, and as that urine would be passing through the animal, is that you get calcium deposits. Those calcium deposits cause issues, and in fact, when you think about it from small ruminants, that's a big challenge. And so when you said that you had a colleague or a neighbor that was losing 1, 2 / call it several, whatever that may be, now that's going to have an impact on the overall portion, overall profitability, overall success of our operation. And so he's correct that if we keep those intact, kind of the maturation, I guess if that's appropriate on the excretion of urine, helps us out so that we can have less urinary calculi. One of those things that we look at would be, again, calcium and phosphorus ratios in our feed, since we got a big gain salesman that's joined us as well, right? Rocking the brand. So options that we can kind of look at there. But, there's, to me, a few things, I guess, more depressing than finding a male animal, Jed, that has urinary calculi, because most of the time when we find it, it's too late already, because they're in distress. There is a blockage in the urethra that's helping it so that they can't urinate. And so there's been something that's been wrong, because obviously those calcium deposits get too big, become problems for us. And so at least from my ideas, as I look at it, it's something that we can be proactive on, from several different things, on balancing of our rations, and as you chose to keep those intact for our males. And so, I mean, I think that makes sense, and it's not fun to treat those. And in fact, it's not successful very often to get them pointed back in the right direction. And so if you find some within your goat operation, within your sheep operation, Jed, and I'm sure you would agree, is that we need to find a solution, because something is wrong with their diet, or something we can try to get those and correct and fix. Because if you have one that goes, there's 2 or 3 more that are subclinical that could be affected at a later time. Sorry, Jed, I just got excited there and
Yep. Oh no, I agree completely. And I don't want to say the only thing I'm doing to prevent urinary calculi by any means is the later castration date. But I just find that the problem is if you castrate them too little, and there's a lot of studies out there talking about it, it ends up with a lot of issues with the urethras, and I can't think of the term, but the tube from the kidney to the bladder ends up being not as developed and smaller. So that if you do have an imbalance, you have a lot higher chance of them having issues with the urinary calculi with the younger castration. Phosphorus, calcium levels in the feed, particularly balancing that to the type of hay that you're feeding is extremely important, because a lot of times, particularly if you're feeding a really good quality alfalfa, particularly the modern varieties, some of those can be really high in calcium, which is how they grow. But if your phosphorus levels to that calcium, particularly in a lot of the goat minerals that are out there, are off, which they are, you can run into some issues with that urinary calculi, even doing everything correctly if something is out of balance.
Outstanding. Okay, and I'm going to do a great transition in theory here. Okay, and so I would echo your advantages in terms of the testosterone, right, of being a natural growth promotant, because it is, right? And even you said on those intact ones. In sheep, we would get from some of our data and others about 0.1 pounds per animal per day, and so instead of 0.7 pounds gain, they can be 0.8 pounds from rams versus wethers. That's going to be a little bit. We could probably cut that in half in relation to goat. In comparison, if they're about half a pound, then maybe it's 0.45 or 0.4, right? So a little bit of a difference is just from that testosterone, but that there is advantages. And a lot of my early work and research, of course, that was more sheep related than goat, but does show that there's can and is most commonly profitability in keeping those intact animals. And particularly if we're selling them at 60 to 70 pounds. And we'll talk about that one in our kind of home base at the marketing as we move forward. But you touched on one that I can't let you get away with, all right? And so you talked on the calcium and phosphorus of our alfalfa and of our hays. And one of the biggest questions that we get is, okay, we're feeding a ration. Good, man. We got the nutritionist, thanks, or at least nutrition focused in terms of your everyday activities and a goat producer. And so one of the things that at least the calls that I get or the interaction, and I've got our colleagues Sabrina and Brenda on representing University of Minnesota Extension as well, would be on the feedstuffs. Okay, and so Jed, so many times, and again, this isn't pointed at anybody. Obviously, I appreciate everybody that's joined us on this evening's call, but the toughest part is, what are we feeding? And that sounds so silly, not from right or wrong, Jed, but a lot of the times, no matter what that species is, and in fact, from cattle, I would say cattle, sheep, and goats. The swine, have a planned diet more so than our ruminants. But do you collect information on the feedstuffs? I know we know what the feedstuff says on the mineral and on, some of our rations, but in terms of hays, you talked about calcium and phosphorus. What is your suggestion, or do you have any guidance and input on the feedstuffs? Like, okay, I bought the hay bale either from the neighbor or I put that up on my own spot, and it was either alfalfa that got rained on 3 times, or it's prairie hay, or it's awesome. And even if it's dairy quality, we could still have problems from that standpoint from bloat or calcium. So just knowing more, what's your thoughts in terms of primarily forages and then balancing it?
Okay, well, so you hit the nail on the head by saying knowing what you're feeding. I spend way more money than I should on my feed business and my own farm on hay testing.
That's okay.
It is, because that way I know what I'm feeding. I know the feed value, I know the protein level, I know the calcium level, the phosphorus level. Otherwise, you're guessing. You can look at a hay and go, oh, that looks like it should be this. But until you actually get it tested, you don't know what you're actually feeding. Now, the only way testing really works, though, is say So like this right now, I'm feeding first crop hay. We'll switch over to the third crop when they start kidding, which will be here in about 2 weeks, and then we'll finish up in the spring with second crop. And I've tested all 3 of those crops. I do raise my own forages, so I have an advantage there. I do know, I know kind of what the fields look like, how they're going to feed just from that, but I do test it. If you're buying hay, if you can, I always recommend if you find a good hay source, you know roughly how much hay you need based off of how many head you have. Try and buy a bunch of hay that's the same. That way you're consistent all the way through, and you don't have to worry about changing the different kinds of hay. Another thing too, as you mentioned, dairy quality. I work with a lot of dairy goats in my business, but meat goats, a lot of people aren't really nearly as picky with what they're feeding. A good grass alfalfa mix is probably far superior to feeding a straight alfalfa if you can get it into the ration correctly and find a good quality hay that's put up well. This year with the weather we had, finding quality hay has been a challenge. There's a lot of cheap hay out there right now, but it's cheap for a reason. There's not a lot of high quality forage available this year, at least on the hay market side of things.
Yeah, Jed, I know, again, I work with Minnesota and North Dakota, but in North Dakota, at least this year, the quantity of hay was up, no doubt. But man, it was tough to find 3 or 4 days in a row where it didn't get a little bit of moisture on it. And so, changes a little bit from that standpoint. And I know that it was very similar, at least in Minnesota as well. We have get to expound on that one. And so, Jed, I don't know if you want this, but man, if we got the most talented people on, we're going to shoot questions at them. And so you signed up for it voluntarily. All right. So if you test your hay, and in fact, my colleagues, Brendan and Sabrina, that are on here, we probably need to do this one as a whole session of how can you interpret the results on your hay tests? Is there a chart of recommended amounts of everything? And so we asked the tough questions there. It came from one of our audience attendees and viewers. Jed, you can have that one. And in fact, we probably need to do a webinar on that one alone.
Yeah, you do, because you could talk for hours just on interpreting hay result tests. But the quick way to look at hay to see on a good hay test is it's going to give you a relative feed value or a relative feed quality, RFV and RFQ values, and that'll give you a really good jumping start on how good a quality the hay is. When you start looking in the dairy industry, they look for a 180 to 200 feed value hay as being a dairy quality hay. Most of the time, what I work with for production market animals, we're looking at feeding a 130 to 150 class hay. And that has to do a lot with your protein levels, your NDF, your non-digestible fiber levels, your ash levels. Ash is anything in the hay that's not digestible. A lot of times in the last few years, we deal with a lot of dirt. This year, because it was muddy, last year, because it was dusty, particularly since a lot of guys now are switching over to the powered rakes. Those actually raise more dirt and dust up into the hay. So we're getting dirtier and dirtier hay samples when we're dealing with a dry condition. And you'll see hay that's 13 to 15% ash, and you're feeding, up to 15% of what they're eating is 100% no nutrition or digestible value to it. Protein isn't as big a deal when we're working with market animals, particularly production animals. If we're talking about growing out lambs, then the protein, of course, gets to be a bigger deal. But a lot of times when I'm working with, hay quality, we're looking more at feeding the does, feeding the ewes, where we're talking more about feed and then hay as a small supplement when we're talking about growing out the production animals. I don't know if that was kind of what you were asking or if I went off on another tangent.
Nailed it. No, I appreciate that. And I think it's an important thing to keep into consideration. In fact, you touched on several different things on the feed value, right, of where that fits. Your logic in terms of, starting with your second cutting, I think you said.
Yep.
Right. And then
first cutting. First cutting first.
The first cutting, then 3-2. And so for those of you, as we think about it, in generalities, and I want to bring this back, but we can kind of say that as we move throughout that summer, the third cutting, right, Jed, would be the more preferred products.
Usually the most digestible. It's usually got the highest vitamin level, mineral level, and a lot of times the way our summers fall, it's put up the best. A lot of times it's our most consistently put up quality hay comes from third crop.
Right, and so as our attendees that are here, just a quick clarification is that as we get to the back end of pregnancies, is that the load and or expectations for the fetus to grow for the back end, the last trimester of pregnancy is very important, right? And so big things happen at the back end of the pregnancy and then the front end of lactation, particularly as you described of does that are going to have kind of some of the more dairy background, right? Because they're
milk fever actually can be a concern.
Yeah, they're milking a bunch, and so some of those resources, kind of how their body's designed, is going to make milk and that production. And so that I think that's so important that when we think about it is that if you have lower quality hay, or even if you purchase that, use it earlier in the gestation process. And now, or wherever it is, if you're within a month or two, either try to find some that's better, which might not be the case, or know that we can supplement with some grains to catch up our energy, or some protein concentrates to improve our proteins. And then if you have, my apologies, Jed, if we have the stuff in the corner, how about we describe that, right? Okay. Because you said that you put up your own hay. So the one that you had to buy from the neighbor, how about that? See, we don't want to make fun of yours, right? The ones that are lower quality, of keeping that lower quality hay and forages, maybe even for drying them up, right? Because we need to decrease then as you moved, and you said you transitioned the goats, or excuse me, the kids that we've got as youngsters, all right? And moving from a weaning standpoint, yours are rolling. I mean, from the descriptions that you've had, those young goats are rolling and they're rocking, and we're getting some gain out of them. Probably, 0.4, 0.5, maybe 0.6 pounds per day should be what they're doing as you described your program. But when you do wean those, this is an important thing as well, as we're talking about just home-based production here in December of 2024, is that when you provide lower quality hays, right, Jed, for those does that have been weaned, right? Because we need to dry them up. And that's the worst thing that we want to do, is to cause challenges on mastitis, either from this round of progeny or the next ones that kind of hurt us in terms of future milk productions. Would you talk about kind of maybe your management strategies there on drying up does? I know what that's forecasting a little farther ahead, but I appreciate your talents and your knowledge, so we might as well grab what we can.
Yep. Drying them off for me, since we've gone to a December kidding, we're drying them off in the spring as we're starting to roll over. And that's usually when I'm feeding up until we're starting dry off. They're on the high quality hay. And then we actually switch them over to both a grass hay, or even a canary grass hay as we're drying them off. We will discontinue the feed. They are on like I mentioned, the lactating ration feed up until about 10 weeks. So about 2 weeks before weaning. Once we're getting closer to weaning, we back off their feed, move them over to it's again a lactating ration that I've developed. It's called Dry Goat. It's a low protein, high mineral feed that we're actually starting to look at getting those does ready for rebreeding in the summer. So as soon as we're done with the weaning stage, we're already looking at the quality of those does and trying to get them set up for our maximum production going into the next season. And part of that has with getting their body score up, their body condition up. As we wean in the spring, then we start working with the rotational grazing. So they actually start going out on pasture. And as soon as the pastures are fit, and of course, the last couple of years, getting pastures to a fit stage has been a challenge, especially this last spring. I don't think my pastures were fit until August, but we had them out there anyway. And that was one reason why we moved out of the dairy cat or the beef cattle, is we completely destroyed almost 4 acres of rotational pasture as a sacrifice just to have the cattle out on pasture. that's one of the reasons why we're looking at switching to sheep, is hopefully the smaller weight animals will be less destructive if we have another wet type spring like we did here locally last year. We had several times in a row where we got 8 inches plus of rain. A week later, we have another 7 inches. A week later, we have another 8 inches. So it made pasturing this year very, very difficult.
Awesome, man. I appreciate the flow of how tonight is going, Jed. I couldn't ask for more. Okay. So, it's just feeding. I'm trying to do my best to control my excitement. All right. And I don't do very good at that. From just the thought process of how you do that. And you transition to my next topics. All right. And so we're going to touch on 2 things, but I'm going to do them one at a time. All right. The first is going to be rotational grazing. The second one's going to be species versus species and or species integration. But the first one there is rotational grazing. And we have that come up in our chat box of kind of describe what rotational grazing means to you. How do you do it? What's the resources? I mean, do we have some poly fences? Do you put up fence all the time, every day? I mean, rotational grazing, that's the topic. The answer is yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so we originally started looking at the rotational grazing, regenerative type agriculture because when we took the farm over, our soil quality was so poor that we had a really hard time growing, particularly the vegetables we were trying to grow. So we started researching it and settled on the idea that we need to restore the microbiome in the soil. Part of that really seems to work well is the animal rotation. Rotational grazing works great on our farm because if we go out there with the browser version or a browser type animal, which is going to be a goat in our case, they go out, they eat the broadleaves, they eat the thistles, they eat the stuff that the grazers don't want to eat. We follow it up with a grazing component, which generally is cattle or sheep. That comes in, they eat the grass type stuff, they graze it down. And we've gone to a pretty heavy rotational grazing, meaning we work the ground fairly hard and move them to the next section and then allow a little bit longer time for that pasture to regenerate. Part of that regenerative process is following up the cattle, and what we were doing is we're running poultry out there, and that's mostly to break up the manure, but it also helps with the health of the chickens. We had a lot of trouble with trying to keep airflow good in our smaller housing we had for chickens, and moving the broiler type birds out onto pasture has greatly reduced our health issues. Plus the chickens, we don't have to deal with the chicken manure. Don't have to worry about spreading it. We don't have to worry about the smell. It just allows us to move that around the pasture. When it comes to fencing, the perimeter fence, like I said, we're going to a hard style fence just to make sure they stay in our farm. Interiorly, we don't care quite as much as a few stragglers get out. We have gone to mostly the electronet fencing and moving that around. And then the chickens, we have to run on electric fencing, otherwise we have such bad predator issues. And that just kind of worked out that we could run the goats in the electric fencing along with the same fencing we're using for the chickens.
Okay, thank you. So appreciate that. And what I caught from there was that you are, I don't know if that's the correct answer, but challenging the forages and saying, you know what, we're going to graze this down and then give it a little bit longer time to kind of
longer time to regenerate. I saw a little question pop up asking about how long do we rotate. That completely depends on the pasture and time of the year, how hard the animals are hitting it. I don't make a decision on time based off of I'm going to move them every 12 hours or 48 hours. I look at the pasture and decide, hey, we need to either move this or they need a little more time on it to get it to where I want it, to look before we move it to the next one. And of course, the pastures take a lot longer to regenerate as we get later in the season. Starting out in the spring, that pasture can bounce back in a really big hurry. Right now, we're running 16 acres in rotation. And we were running about 100 head of goats and 20 head of cattle on that. So,
oh, that's crazy efficiency.
That's the goal.
Yeah. Nice work.
But we use a lot of compost. Our manure all ends up being composted and then spread. So we're a year out on all of our manure. And with all the animals we have, we end up with basically be able to supply most of our own fertilizer needs, at least for our forages.
All right, you're starting it. You see, you changed the conversation. All right, Jed. So teach me about your composting program.
Well, that's nothing fancy. It's a big pile, and we use the skip loader in the tractor to turn it. The idea is I'm just trying to break down particularly the nitrogen in there to make it out of the poultry manure, to make it a little more palatable into the biome without causing damage. So.
Well, it's certainly underutilized in my opinion. Jed, as you described that is that when we think about it, even from an agriculture standpoint, no matter what your species is that the nitrogen and the advantages in terms of chemicals to soil health and getting that spread back on there is truthfully tough to quantify. I mean, people can say that that's important, but when we do that, I mean, to me, it's so easy to say that, that agriculture is the recyclers of our earth and of our planet. It's like, you know what, this is what happened. We produced and made high quality protein and the back that some would call the waste, we sent back in and it made our pastures better. So, I mean, I think it's a fun story when Jed brings up the word compost and say, hey, we're digging and making it happen, right? And sending primarily the nitrogen, but also other minerals and things to help us out.
Oh, yes. And the other thing we're noticing on this rotational pasture, this was technically our third full year, but we had smaller sections that were more of an experiment. We don't see the water pool on top of the pasture anymore. It soaks in right away. We don't see the damage. This last year was an exception to the rule because we had so much moisture that the cattle, particularly, or even the goats, were sinking in so far that there wasn't anything we could do about the damage. But a lot of years, that soil rebounds better. We don't, when you see an animal walking across wet soil, they're not leaving the big heavy tracks that are there forever. The soil rebounds faster. In the spring on that rotational pasture, and then this is cropland that we've taken out of production and put into pasture. It was marginal cropland, but it was still cropland that was in production. 2 or 3 of the big spots that we had water constantly, stuff would drown out. There's not any water sitting in it anymore after 3 years of the rotational pasture out there. In the spring, our fields, even compared to our hay fields, those rotational pastures are greener a week earlier and are growing faster. They melt off in the spring faster, right? And I think that's just from the microbial action that's in the soil in those pastures. So there's a lot of advantages to the rotational style grazing and really doing a hard graze and then moving the animals onto the next paddock and allowing that soil to recover instead of just, putting the animals out on the 16 acres and say, here you guys go, just have at it.
Absolutely. And so I respect at least the idea of compaction. Again, soil health isn't my talents, but I know the right people that are. Yep. In either side of our system here in Minnesota and North Dakota, I mean, I have some great talented people that we're surrounded with on soil health. And so I never, when I was growing up, Jed, I never soil impaction. That would make no sense to me, Yep. It doesn't. What is that? But when you get 7 inches of rain and a 1,400-pound cow drops a left front foot there, that soil is a little different than what it was, the 3 yep. seconds before it, right? And so, yep. I guess, and again, that's something that we're always continuing to try to learn. But even when we think about it from a rangeland standpoint, is that there's that's out there. But maybe the biggest question of our webinar tonight is let's talk about just kind of the second half of that of integration of species. And so, what I respect the most is that you've talked about, even sheep and goats and cattle, and potentially we come back to sheep. But some of those can then happen. And that's probably one of the bigger questions that I get, at least in terms of my Minnesota group as well, is like, how do we incorporate this and that? Yes and no, and what can we do? And sometimes just big picture. And again, it's probably not as much on 16 acres, but if we have larger spots, is that the leafy spurge, right? So if people have the weed that is leafy spurge, the sheep will love that. You send them out there, go eat that yellow flower before the cattle get to it, and it can cause some challenges, and goats as well. There's differences. What even from a basic scientist standpoint or basic production approach is that I like to think of it this way is that and I know it's not 100%, but the sheep eat's going down and the goat eat's going up, right? I mean, if there's trees or leaves up there, I mean, they love that, just from a browse, and so they
Yep.
can actually be in the same spot and not even be competing. I mean, I'm
Nope.
not saying that there's everything up here, but let's just dig on that for a little bit, Jed, in terms of just harmony and integration of our species. Thanks, Jed.
So our pasture mix we planted was nothing that was standard. I actually put together a mix myself out there, and it was 50% of 8 different varieties of grasses. I don't remember what they all are, cold and warm season. I don't have that list in front of me. Then we also had red clover, white clover, alfalfa. I think that was it in the mix. And I don't remember the exact ratios, but the idea I wanted something that would produce something that was desirable to the goats, something that was also desirable to the cattle. And the mix worked out very well because the goats go out there. And then, of course, being that it was production land, we do have weed issues, or it has weed issues. Thistles, where there were some very large thistle patches, which the goats have successfully removed for me completely. Thistles are goat candy, and they've pretty much completely got rid of those thistle patches for me. We also had a fair amount of herbicide-resistant ragweed, and believe it or not, goats will eat ragweed. You wouldn't want them to eat too much of it if if they're milking goats and you're drinking the milk, because that can really adversely affect the flavor. But goats really do enjoy eating ragweed, and I think they're actually getting ahead of that in these commercial land that was, production land that the weeds actually got out of control on. I think it's a lot of fun to watch the goats go out, and especially when they're on a fresh pasture, they are running all over the place. They're looking for stuff that's not grass. To eat. They're actively searching for anything that, like you said, that they'll eat up, and that's what they're looking for. And we kind of run with the goats. We want them to eat most of what's available, what they like, before we move them to the next pasture. And then we move the grazing component in. I've never thought about running goats and sheep together. We always ran the goats separate from the cattle, just because we didn't want them mixing, because there was just a little too much chance of, particularly the young stock, getting a little riled up and wild and causing some injuries to the goats. But goats and sheep together would be an interesting idea. I've never thought about doing that.
Well, we certainly could, and I think, Jed, that just kind of depends in terms of resources, right? I mean, you said you're stacking and just digging hard on 16 acres, which is great, okay, and that's why I appreciate your efficiencies and utilizing what resources that you do have, but
we're trying to take advantage of our short grazing season. Up here,
Yeah.
I have some friends that are down in Missouri in that area, and they get an extra month of grazing compared to what we do.
Right.
And they couldn't graze the animals I do, I don't think, on 16 acres. But with our short grazing season, it's successful.
Right.
I'd love to be able to have them graze more time out of the year where I have to feed less hay. But unfortunately, we just don't get enough heat units and grazing days to do that.
Yeah, and I think, one of the interesting things, if we describe, Minnesota homeland as or our Minnesota properties as kind of our evaluation from this standpoint, is that, I mean, if you're to some of the black soils, if I was to describe that, right, Jed? I mean, there's some places in Minnesota where it would be a poor financial investment to put goats on. How's that? When
Yep.
you can make row crops. And
Yep.
so, we know that. But there's also places that it's the answer, right? And there's also places in, just to use the state of Minnesota, where it's tough. Okay. And those would be the ones that I would call more of the woody brush, browse type things, like, whoa, I mean, my backyard is either a river or it isn't a river, but there's more trees than you want, not as many cool season grasses, maybe, as you were thinking in terms of home base. But what's fun from that standpoint, when I think about it, is that those goats can kind of dig and not dig. I said that they were shooting like this. If you had a place that was kind of intermediate to kind of on saying options for those goats to consume, is that they love that browse, that, brushes, the things that might be at a riverfront or at the backyard, or even like a slough type things, and kind of dig in. So their utilization, I think, from a goat standpoint, is epic. Sorry, I shouldn't use that word, but it seems like it. I mean,
Yep.
Because the cow's gonna walk past it.
Yep.
Okay, the sheep has got their head down. They didn't even know that happened. And the goat's
Yep.
like, I'm going to snag every leaf off of that little brush over there, and I'm going to make it mine, and I'm going to make it in protein. So that's kind of cool
Yep.
to me,
Yep.
And so I think that there's probably, even when we think about it, of saying the smaller operation, or boutique operations, of saying, you know what, these are things that I can do, and help to move forward with it, is that they like different things. And so some of the times they can be complementary on
Yep.
our programs. I'm going to dig just a little bit. Thanks for letting me share kind of my thoughts on that. And this is maybe one of the things that, or the topics that I enjoy most, but that's me. But you talked a little bit about marketing at the front. And so we went on a 50-minute sideways kind of a shift. But when you talked about marketing, you talked about making your goats efficient, and your goats that you have are more meat focused, and that's perfectly good. And I will say this before I even give that one to you, is that there is value in the market, in my personal opinion, for those that are more boar goat influenced and meat goats. And so, in fact, when goats kind of came into the area, everybody's like, cool, great, goat, I'll buy it. But our people that are purchasing those now are like, yeah, I want the ones with a little bit of power.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so they're worth, you call it $30, $40, $50 a hundredweight more, to have a little bit extra muscle to them. You talked 60 to 70. So basically, I truthfully couldn't argue. To me, if I was to pick numbers, that would be what I would write down if I had to pass my GOAT 101 test tomorrow in finals week at the University of Minnesota. Okay, I might write down 60 to 75 pounds, ideal market weight, because there's some value to it, particularly as we move forward. You're doing it efficiently. Once you get over some of those, you can get discounted just a smidge at the market sometimes, right? And so it might not fit what our customer is aiming for. And so, sorry, that was a long prelude to marketing. Tag, you're it.
Okay, so you mentioned it again, right? Exactly what I agree with is the fact that you've got to hit the market for what you've got to hit the target for what the market's looking for. 60 to 70 has been kind of the market weight for quite a while, and that has a lot to do with the quality of the meat, the frame, basically structural component, the bones versus the muscling, and from on the feed side, we can grow an animal with good genetics really efficiently from that up to that 60 to 75 pounds. As we get a goat that's heavier than that, we start really losing the efficiency. So it's taking more feed to put the weight on. And we start actually, that animal weighs more. You get maybe the same amount, maybe a little less per pound, but you got more poundage, but it's taking you a lot more to get that animal to that weight. And that's what I really mean by efficiency. I want to get as much usage, or the animal to get as much as it can out of the feed that I'm giving it to gain the most weight, get that rate of gain up there. And that's how I keep the goats particularly profitable, is by kind of carefully managing how much it takes me to get them to the market weight. When it comes to marketing, I'm adapting constantly. When we were raising dairy goats, or the dairy bucklings, the market we were selling to, they had to be disbudded, they had to be castrated, and if they were over 80 pounds, they wouldn't even take them. So we had to be really careful with raising weights, and they had to be, raised in a particular way. Now where we're selling a few more of them at auction or having goat buyers come to the farm, there's going to be some more opportunities here for us in central Minnesota, it looks like, with a processing plant that's hopefully going to be opening up somewhat local to us. When I say local, within a couple hours of us. So that's going to change too, depending on what they're looking for. But you got to be adaptable. I just, every year I kind of look and go, what are we looking at? We're probably going to be the most profitable type of animals that we can raise, and that's what we shoot for. And that's one reason why we're looking at moving again into the sheep is well, multiple reasons, but is the marketing on it is a little bit easier to hit than to say it is with the cattle. The cattle, the market's high, but inputs are high. It costs a lot of money to raise a beef steer to 16, 17 months of age. Where if I can get a lamb raised up quicker off my farm faster, I get my money that I invested back faster.
Absolutely. No, thank you in terms of that interpretation. I'm going to let you expound just a smidge, and I know this is actually forecasting, Jed, but so I apologize if that's too much, but tell me just a little bit of what your thoughts are of the an opportunity for a processing facility in central Minnesota.
Well, I think the opportunity is there because if we can stop having to transport these market animals to Iowa, to Pennsylvania, to Illinois, we're just opening up less stress for the animals, less operating costs, and we're hopefully opening up more value up to the producers by having a more local option for processing. The plant I was talking about, I don't want to talk about it too much, is down in Wilmer. Okay. There's a guy down there that's looking at opening it up. He's broke ground on it. He's hoping by mid-spring to be starting to run processing both for sheep and goats. He's going to have a fixed marketing price, which is going to let us know what he's paying on a weekly basis based off of a market down in Iowa. There's a lot of positives going forward. I'm not saying it's the fix-all. I'm not saying it's the only way to market, but it's giving us another tool in the toolbox. And anytime we can have more options, it just gives us more. I have producers that the only way they sell is there's some goat buyers running around. They stop at the farm. Whatever they tell them is the price. They ship the animals, and that's fine. They're happy with the price they're getting. But I look and see what prices they're bringing at the different auction houses. I've shipped as far as 6 hours away. I've taken goats to get a premium price, and as long as I can make up that time and fuel with the price, it makes sense. Other times, I'll get a cheaper price selling at the local auction house. But it's easy. It's 20 minutes from me. I can put the animals there. I get a price I'm happy with, and I'm good. So I think the key to marketing is don't get stuck in a rut and only do one thing. Really pay attention to what the markets are doing, what the market's looking for, and be adaptable.
I'm going to actually expound on this just a little bit more than I was planning. And so even from a sheep standpoint, and again, that's home base, but, some of our animals at North Dakota State University, if we get a large group of them, it's more valuable from a price discovery standpoint for those to go to Sioux Falls Regional Livestock. And because we know that most of the buyers are there. In Minnesota, there's, I think, in my personal opinion, a few more regional options, right? I mean, you shouldn't have to drive 4 hours because there are some regional options from sheep and goats of what they're out there. The other thing is that even when I think about it from marketing, is that, and particularly in goats, is that, and I know this sounds simplistic, but it's not, is that an animal is worth what 2 people think that it's worth, right, Jed? Or at least 1.5, somebody to push that. Yes. Because somebody has to win, but somebody had to push them. And there's different times of the year where that 70-pound, boar goat wether is worth a lot. And there's different times in the year when that 70-pound boar goat wether isn't worth as much as I was planning on it to get it there to the sale barn. And so I think that it is really, really important when we think about, marketing in generalities, particularly if you're going to sell them all at once, right? Because in theory, some of the times, I like to think from a small ruminant standpoint on sheep and goats is that holidays are important, right? And so if you can smash and get into some of the different ethnic holidays and get there 1 week before everybody needs their goat, then congratulations, you made more money than your neighbor, right, Jed?
Yep.
So just talk a little bit about that. Have you won, or have you lost, or have you learned on timing of the market?
I'm going to go mostly with learned. Okay. I've hit the target. I've missed the target more than I've hit the target.
Yeah.
And some of that can be as simple as breeding. At one point, absolutely. I tried to do an early breeding program, which was great in theory, but in practicality, I ended up with, maybe less than 20% of my first group bred on the first cycle, and then I had 50% on the second group, and my kidding stretched out way longer than I wanted it to. And then all of a sudden, I'm dealing with another problem of the fact that I've got animals in different size groups that I've got to worry about feeding in different fashions. And that starts to get really complicated too, where it's nice to have one group that you can kind of treat as a group rather than having to break them up into a lot of multiple pieces. At one point, we used to kid 3 or 4 groups. We've actually gone with the let's get it all over with at one time strategy, and now kid in one big group. Just get all the hard work done, get the sleepless nights done with all in one shot, and and then worry about the next stage of it. I would love to get back to some time where I could get enough buildings up to probably do some more diverse kidding time frames. But on our farm, we ran into enough damage from the storms that we haven't structurally gotten back to where we can do 3 or 4 kidding groups.
Right. And I guess my opinion on that one, and sometimes people ask me like, well, how many animals, and just, both sheep and goat analogous of how many should I have? And there's no right or wrong. I mean, everybody can identify what they want, but man, if I have to go out in the lambing barn and or kidding barn, or get to go out in those, I want to make it worthwhile. I don't want to go out at midnight for like 4 days in a row and like, well, darn it, I guess tomorrow. And so I feel as though, and this is me, I guess I get from a national standpoint, when people get asked this, like, well, what is the correct number? And from an extension standpoint, and I say this mostly humoristically, is that people are like, well, it depends. Well, I'm not going to say that, okay, Jed, because I don't like that answer. I think that if you want to do it, and this is my personal opinion, again, it's not gospel, but if you want to have an operation, it's so much more fun if you have 40 to 50 head. That allows you the chance to go out there and know that if you time up your breedings, that something's going to happen, and that your dedication and time commitment is worth just a little bit more. And again, that's me being rebellious.
Well, and I think 40 to 50 head is a good number, if you got a lot of other stuff going on, because that's 40 to 50 animals you have to manage. And each one of those animals takes a certain amount of time for management. We find originally we were thinking of running up to 300 does. And we've decided that our end goal is probably going to be around 200 animals total, if we're looking at goat size animals. Now, I start talking units where cattle were actually taking up a larger amount of animal units, just for intake, for manure, for space needed, for all that kind of stuff. Where I was treating a cow as really taking up the space of 10 goats. And I know that isn't necessarily the industry standard, but that was the number I was using.
That's probably pretty logical. Yeah.
Yeah. So, when we had 20 head of cattle, that was a lot of animal space that we had taking up, that we're going to be able to add now to our goat herd, and hopefully add sheep into the equation again. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I have to retract and kind of move back just one step, Jed, and then we're going to close this up. And so, but I had one that was important to kind of dig from. Okay. And so an individual that was earlier, it said, never heard of banding horns. What exactly is that? What age do you castrate or band your bucklings? And you talked about that actually farther on. But why is it necessary? And this one's legitimate as well. Why is it necessary to dehorn terminal or meat goats? Because they're going to market. So what's your thoughts just from that generalities?
So on the standard market animals, we don't dehorn unless the market requested it, like we did when we were raising the dairy bucklings. They wouldn't buy them if they had horns, so we had to dishorn that group. And again, that's following your marketing, what the market's looking for. We had an opportunity to sell these animals at a premium, and it was a little more work, yes, but the premium more than made up for it. So it's not, otherwise I would rather leave the horns on. We do dehorn a fair number of our bucks, especially in our larger bucks, to help with aggressiveness. They just seem to, if they don't have those horns up there, they don't do the damage that they can otherwise. Going back to castrating, we talked about that. I like to do it at about 10 weeks. Any younger, I seem to have other issues. Any older, then you can start getting the aggression. sometimes, especially in larger groups. And banding horns, that is an interesting subject. You're actually using the heavy duty castration bands, and you're actually banding them right up against the skull, and it actually causes the blood flow to the horns to cut off, and the horns eventually will come off. It's not a real quick process. It takes 30 to 45 days, but it generally is mostly painless, and it will allow you to actually dehorn where you don't have to worry about opening up that sinus cavity like you can. People say, yeah, you can gouge out a goat horn. Yeah, you got an awful lot of risk there of opening up sinus cavities, and then you got another whole world of problems getting that healed up. So it's a safe alternative to, if you didn't get something disbudded. In my opinion, it's a safe alternative, or a safer alternative to still allow you to remove a set of horns. It also works for skurs. So if you have an unsuccessful dehorning, or disbudding, which can happen too.
Yeah, and if those horns get growing, I mean, we are now, in my personal opinion, even from an animal well-being standpoint, is that that horn's real. I mean, there's a whole bunch of nerve endings. So if you can do that there, like you said, from a younger standpoint, you're allowing that animal to succeed, right? And so at a later point, you don't, or we don't want to kind of cause challenges or distress to any animals. In production animals. I mean, one of the things that even when I think about it, and again, I get a little bit compassionate, right? Is that I grew up on a sheep and cattle operation. Home base for me is South Dakota. I live in Fargo, America now. But if you're in production agriculture and you don't care about animals, that would be confusing, right, Jed? And so I get intrigued, so I'm like, well, you don't understand. I'm like, no, that's not true. Like, nobody cares more than me. That's why I do what I do. That's why you do what you do. And so if that's something that's beneficial for their lives and something that's beneficial for what we can do in the production of red meat protein, potentially goat milk, sheep milk, cow milk, right? Okay, not oat milk. That's a different deal. All right, that's oat. But anyway, like, even when we think about it from a protein and fiber, and even in our milk products, I mean, people have a compassion, and I appreciate everybody that's joined us. Man, we have a great following at the University of Minnesota Extension on our sheep and goat webinar series. And man, Jed, I know, right or wrong, this was just a fun discussion. Okay. And so we had some great talks on topics that were interested to our goat professionals. And as strange as this is, our goat amateurs, right, Jed? And so we talked about things all the way along the way, from our genetics to our nutrition and why we do what we do from a reproduction, and then kind of focused there at the back end in marketing of our products. And so do you have any comments? I want to give you the floor at the back end. And Brenda shared on our function here is that January 27th is our next talk, and that will be on looking at lambing and kidding season and getting it prepared. So, Jed, what's your go-to? What's home base? I mean, we talked now for an hour and 13 minutes, and so any closing comments or thoughts as we kind of discuss tonight?
Well, I'd like to just mention on top of the, you mentioned about animal care. I want my animals to have at worst one bad day, and that's probably processing day. If it's a male, maybe two, because I don't think castration looks like much fun for them. But I care about the animals. I want the animals to be healthy. I want the animals to be happy. And I don't want to do anything that's detrimental to the animals. And actually, from a financial standpoint too, if you want to look at it that way, an unhappy animal is not an animal that's gaining and isn't going to be profitable either. You can even look at it from the standpoint on that. I really like working with the animals. I like working with farmers. That's why I'm in the industry that I am. I enjoy being outside. I enjoy almost all the aspects. There's always some negative aspects to anything that you're doing, but it's just farming is a wonderful way to make a living and provide something that's really needed in our world. So, and I'm very passionate about local food movement. I'm very passionate about the regenerative grazing, soil health, and that's another whole reason why I am doing what I'm doing with our farm.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jed. So just my quick interpretation from there is that, of doing why we do what we do. And I think that there's an important part of that is that, it's not about scale, because people can have 2 goats in the backyard or 50 goats or 500 or whatever that may be. And even when we think about it from an agriculture, of if they're large operations, medium operations, small operations, is that the passion is important, right? And so I never question those that say, okay, well, I only got 10 goats here. What can I do? Those might be the people that either want to have more information or that they're very compassionate about making sure that part of their operation is important. Okay. And so everybody that we have in agriculture is providing protein, whether that's meat or milk or even fibers. Let's see. I got to give the shout out to the Cashmere goat farmer. All right. No matter where that is. And so it's so much fun. Jed, that was a frank discussion, but I think a very comprehensive approach. That people can be good of putting the priorities where they want to be. And we talked about reproduction, we talked about genetics, we talked about nutrition, we talked about marketing all along the way. And in fact, understanding what we do. So I think a big part from my take homes, Jed, is identifying the goals that you want in your operation, and then identifying those within each segment of how can I get there, right? And when you talked about marketing, you said, this is what I need to do to feed. Okay. When you talk about genetics, this is what I needed to do. I added an eighth or a quarter of dairy genetics. And so I appreciate everybody that has that's joined us tonight. Again, I got the opportunity to just share Jed's story. Jed, are you okay with that? Like, we got to just tell your story. So appreciate you very much. Yeah, right on. And also my colleagues, Brenda Miller for the University of Minnesota Extension. Also, Sabrina Florentino is a talented individual within our group. And for those that have joined us, we're going to be back again. We're rocking and rolling. We got some January, some February, some March is rolling. And so January, we'll be back again. And so I appreciate everybody to help and be a part of this. And remember, through the University of Minnesota Extension, we're driven to discover. And at North Dakota State University, we're extending knowledge and changing lives. Thanks for joining us on a beautiful Tuesday evening, December 17, 2024. Charge on. Enjoy your day.